NAPA and others have all done research around trust in government, and we know that it's lower than it should be. This is true of most democracies, and that should be deeply concerning to us because trust in our democratic institutions, like that shows that, look, those institutions are legitimate. It shows that the people are going to continue to be willing to put faith and investment in them, and it shows that they're going to be willing to participate in them. When that goes down, it means that all of that big house of cards starts to crumble a little bit.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. In this episode, we're exploring our current system of governance and how to help government be more responsive, innovative, and citizen-centered. As public institutions face growing complexity and evolving expectations, the mechanisms that support them must evolve too. We're joined today by Loren DeJonge Schulman, an Academy Fellow and leading voice in national security, public service reform, and organizational strategy. Loren brings deep experience from the White House, the Pentagon, and think tanks, and is now helping shape how government can better serve the American public through smarter systems, stronger leadership, and more human-centered design. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Loren, let's just dive right in. You've worked across multiple sectors, government, think tanks, and academia. How has your perspective on public governance evolved over time? And what do you see as the most pressing challenges facing public administration today?
I think so here's a few things that evolved over time. As you know, I started my career as a presidential management fellow. I worked most of the first 10 years of public service in Department of Defense and the National Security Council. And without quite realizing it, I was a government capacity, government management person, even though that was never my title. I was always doing national defense strategy or helping implement new strategies around reform in the security sector. And all of my frustrations and questions all had to do with, do we actually have the people that we need to do this? Like, have we actually listened to I'll say customers, but like the stakeholders and the communities who should be a part of these conversations? If I came up with the best possible speech for the president to read tomorrow, do we actually have the ability to implement it in a few days? So I was a sort of a nagging back of my mind government capacity person without really realizing it. And this is one of those things, like, I think it took way too many, frankly, aha moments of, oh, no, being the nag in the meeting who's asking these questions isn't just being a nag. It's a whole important, frankly, more important function in the work that we do. I attempted to, when I left government for the first time, I went to go work for an organization called Center for New American Security, to start to really implement that. Working at a think tank it's a lot of fun. It's a great place to put your ideas on paper, to socialize them amongst experts. But the thing that I tried to do most when I was at CNES that really is driving my career now is have hard conversations with my fellow researchers and senior fellows and otherwise around, how would we actually do that? Like, I love your idea around sanctions. I love your idea around Middle East policy. I love your idea around how we get the Department of Defense to do this better. But let's actually spend time on the no kidding nuts and bolts of how that actually works. To me, that is the biggest game changer that I've had over the course of my career. Was we can have the most beautiful strategies. We can have the most wonderful policies that are written. We can have things that are resonant and that are compelling to people. But if you haven't thought through the people, the implementation, and also how all those stakeholders are going to react and participate in that, you're doing it wrong. And that sounds, I know for most of this audience, it sounds so obvious, but it is mind-boggling to me how often you encounter policy debates that are totally ignoring all of those pieces. So being able to try to bring those into the conversation as best I can is the work that I'm doing now, but also trying to help folks think through what's a better way to do this in the future.
So your words, not mine, but you self-described as a nag, which can play an important role in a lot of different places. But how does that help government actually change and see itself differently? I mean, this is a time where you hear a lot of conversation about reinventing government, reimagining government. It takes a voice, potentially a nagging voice, but it takes one nonetheless to kind of help see that through. In your experience, where have you seen that been able to really advance and why?
I think the places where there's been the biggest change has almost always started with a question of, what is it that the American people actually want out of this? And whether that be veterans or families who have a new kid or somebody who's retiring from the military, and transitioning to veteran status, or somebody who is facing that or has experienced a disaster, if you start with the question of, on this incredibly stressful moment that they're experiencing, or maybe a happy moment, depending on what the transition is for them, what is it that they need most? And how can we, as a government that has worked really hard to provide them with resources, benefits, services, and capacity, actually make that moment as best we can for them? That generates change for a couple of reasons. One, the basic one is like you'll design your program better. Like if you've actually talked to people about in that moment, what do you need the most? And if you think about like all the burden that we accidentally place on folks who are experiencing this toughest days of their lives, instead of actually placing that burden on them, we can place that burden elsewhere. But the other reason that I think it actually helps generate change is that it brings public servants back into the entire mission of public service. We didn't all sign up, maybe some of us did, but most of us didn't sign up to write really good memos every day. We probably didn't sign up in order to develop forms that were incredibly challenging to get through or to write budgets without thinking about the impact. When you start with that question of what is it that the American people who are trying to serve actually want and need and are owed based on authorities that we have developed, you are then reorienting yourself around like why we all took that oath in the first place. No matter what happens after, you will almost certainly be starting from a better foundation of delivering from them better. Now, you have to do a lot of work after that to be able to engage the American people in what does that service or program look like? How do you know that it's actually working well? How do you adapt it over time to change circumstances? And maybe how do you adjust many programs that they're all operating and function together? But that first question and just listening is going to get you so much further than the most beautifully written memo that you've ever done.
I'm picking up on two themes here. One is around kind of leadership and the public servants and how they serve the American people. And the other is central to what government's main purpose is, which is actually serving the American people. So two questions here. One is what type of talent, skills, and characteristics are needed to really serve the American people well? And then the second is how has the public's expectations of government shifted over time, and where do you think they are now?
There's always a lot of conversation around what kind of skills that we need in government specifically. And I think you and I could have a really nerdy conversation right now around like people need to be able to use data better. They need to be able to write. They need to understand the levers of government, whether that be financial assistance or creating incentives or constraints around innovation, whether that be creating new infrastructure. Like there's a lot of toolkits in government that it's useful for people to understand and be an expert in. But I think that if I could wave a magic wand and really reorient public service today, it would place an imperative on everybody having a role in community engagement in some way. And, maybe that doesn't make sense for every single person. But for a lot of folks, it's actually much harder than it should be for public servants and federal agencies, and also state and local too, to engage directly with the folks who most are impacted by their policies. And yeah, there's a whole lot of places where you can go in and provide public comments, and there's the Federal Register, and there's roundtable meetings and so on. But in a lot of cases, or almost all cases, we're putting the burden on American citizens in order to come to the federal government and say, hey, here's what we think. If we could reset and have most public servants, no matter their role, have a much more community-facing, community-engaging, place-based function in the work that they do, I think we'd have a really, really different government in many ways. There's a lot of changes that would have to come with that. Maybe in the case of like how we set up our federal agencies. Do they have more regional orientation? Do we have more local offices? Do we have places where you're interacting much more closely with the federal government one-to-one? But I think that's a really interesting thing to explore. I don't know precisely myself what Americans want out of their government. And I say that because I don't think actually a whole lot of people know, and we need to get better at asking that question and caring about the answer, not assuming that the technocrats that work in our field have the best possible ideas around that, because we have a lot of built-in, baked-in systems and authorities and agencies that have made that assumption over time around what we should be doing. And There may not be wrong, but there's a lot of things that government continues to put a significant amount of time and investment into that are legacy rather than responsive to needs. But in terms of the what they do want, I think there's some clues that we should look at that are interesting. So we have all NAPA and the Partnership for Public Service and OMB and others have all done research around trust in government, and we know that it is like it's lower than it should be. This is true of most democracies. And that should be deeply concerning to us because trust in our democratic institutions, like that shows that, look, those institutions are legitimate. It shows that the people are going to continue to be willing to put faith and investment in them. And it shows that they're going to be willing to participate in them. When that goes down, it means that all of that big house of cards starts to crumble a little bit. So one, I think that work around what drives trust is really important. And there's things that we know about that, whether that be around transparency or responsiveness, feeling as though you're being heard by government, coming back to my point around listening at the beginning, feeling as though when something goes wrong, that it is going to be repaired in some way, feeling as though there's somebody who's actually invested in some of the largest challenges of our time. Like a lot of those elements are what government should be thinking about as it orients its role to the public. And I think that a lot of those things are resident, but we can do a much better job at communicating them. And two, we can recognize that investing in those is an imperative rather than a nice to have. As a final piece, I'll say on the point around that trust in government element that helps us understand what is it that Americans want, is that I think Americans would like to be asked what they want from the government. I don't know that nerdy question, asking it in that exact nerdy way is the best way to do it. But I think that in particular, the pandemic, climate change, AI, it shows that people have an interest in the role that government plays in their lives and being able to create opportunities beyond just election day to say, all right, what should that look like? Particularly around the 250th anniversary of our country is a really exciting one. And we should take advantage of that as a fun and engaging and exciting opportunity rather than something that seems like a chore.
Going back to your point about community engagement, how do you do that when you have declining trust in government? And then you just mentioned another really good point that the public should be asked what they would expect of government. But how does that work when we have such partisan divide and we have a lot of debate over different policies? And our country really right now is really struggling to kind of get to a middle common ground where everyone can kind of agree that there's a way forward.
So on that second question, I don't have a good solution on the how, but let me tell you the what of what I think is important here. There's some really interesting research that shows a lot of reporting around work that is done in government, new policy changes, ideas around reforms. It is all reported in two ways that are detrimental. One is it's reported as like a horse race style, like, well, James-Christian has a proposal to do this, and Loren has a proposal to do that. And second, it rarely talks about government as is. What are the programs that we have today? What is the role of government today? What does government wake up and do every day in some ways? So I want to be clear that I don't think there's a need for Americans to be indoctrinated into every function and agency and organizational chart and budget line. But I do think that we can do a better job in our entire information ecosystem around just being really clear about here's where things are today. That is a much better foundation for what are the changes that we might want than the horse race style debate that I mentioned before and the polarized risk that you talked about as well. That polarized conversation is much more based around the horse race and the changes that people are seeking rather than where are we actually at in this moment. The second piece of that, there's so much mythology around what government is, what it isn't, the differentiation between federal, state, and local, the difference between policies that were put together by one administration versus another, the roles of Congress versus the executive branch. So a lot of folks think about that and they say, like, oh, we need better civics education. Yes, I think that's true. But I think I would flip the switch a little bit and have the conversation around civic education be around how do we create better roles and opportunities for Americans to engage in that what they want, what they are concerned about, what they are worried about, what they desire, rather than it be a more passive conversation of here's how a bill becomes law or here's how the executive branch works. There are a lot of organizations that are doing work in that vein. And I think it's really, particularly over these next few years, really critical to invest in those sort of conversations around civics is not a passive experience you have, it's an active role, and not put burden on Americans to do it, but to show opportunity and to create opportunity for engaging in that debate.
So you mentioned a little bit about if you were to ask the American public what they might need, and then you'd want government to respond, you should start with, well, what does government currently do, and what is its current
Yeah.
capacity? My fear is if you were to ask that question, or at least provide information around that, we might find that government is antiquated or outdated, or there are certain
Yep.
things that could certainly be done better. What are some of the big picture things that you've come across in your career, or things that you've researched that you think we can just do better at?
So none of these sound incredibly big or sexy, but they're important. They don't happen easily today. So, as an example, if you looked at all of the programs that were meant to address challenges around children not having enough to eat in some way, or children not having all the resources they needed to be healthy and safe and secure, those are in multiple agencies, in multiple program offices. They have multiple kinds of applications. They have multiple entry points for people to be able to have that in gates. Why is that? That's crazy. Can we have a government structure that has an outcomes focus, and we are working as a portfolio team to try to solve problems together rather than dividing up all of our toolkits into tiny, tiny bits and pieces? And some of that is a Congress problem, some of that is a legacy problem, but some of it is just like instances of bureaucracy. We can do better on that. And not just for that one portfolio area. There's so many places we're having a much more experiential portfolio approach towards outcomes rather than a legacy siloed programmatic approach is going to get you better things what you want. So that's one. And that's hard. Like I just said that as though we could just do that tomorrow. That takes a lot of work. Some of the other things that are easier though are so much of the work that we do in government is really, really compliance driven. And that has reason behind it. That comes back to some of that lack of trust in government. And because of that lack of trust, there's a whole lot of boxes you have to check to do anything. That's not terrible, but if those boxes that you check are much more about getting to outcomes rather than compliance around did you do that process right, we'd have better results. We'd have better results when you outcomes-based procurement. Are you actually getting the outcome you wanted out of the service or the good that you were trying to buy, rather than did this check all the boxes? If you had outcomes-based service provision and you invested more in innovative programs that actually got you the outcome better or faster, that's an opportunity too. I think the third thing I would say that, again, this is not a sexy or big new idea, is having much more talent permeability between the federal, state, and local workforce. Be very purposeful about it because, frankly, there's only so much of that some technical talent that we can go around. But also to be able to have talent move around in academia, the private sector, and other places so that we have a core of civil servants who are doing incredible good work for years at a time, while also being to draw on the incredible ingenuity of the American people in a flexible, shorter term tour of duty sort of way. So folks can come in and we can all learn from each other. They can take those lessons back out, and we have a much better model of bringing ideas and ingenuity in. Again, none of those are big or radical, but they don't happen today, and we should put effort towards making them do that.
For those who will be joining us for a 2025 national conference, we do have a session that talks about what the next 250 years looks like and the future of government. And I know, Loren, that you'll be participating in that. And so we'll have more opportunity to hear from you on that point. Let's talk about the partnerships and how government can work with other sectors. What do you think about the role and what it should be of philanthropy, of nonprofits, of the private sector, of the American citizen?
I think one big one, particularly for nonprofits, is helping be a partner to government in terms of generating new innovations and piloting those ideas in ways that government is not often set up well to do quite purposely. Government should be more innovative. They should be better at experimentation. But there's also reasons that you want government to be so much more steady, straight and narrow than other organizations that are allowed to go off and experiment. When government is able to partner actively with nonprofits and philanthropies to say, look, we think there's opportunities in these 5 different spaces. Can you help us figure out ways to generate those ideas and test? That's a wonderful collaborative role for them to bring to bear. Another place is in helping organize around and think about the future. For all that, you and I think it's incredibly important for government to adopt more of a foresight futures mindset. We know that it is challenging, but if government is able to generate that sort of symbiotic relationship with academics, with nonprofits, and other thinkers to say, help us come up with a better understanding of future opportunities, risks, challenges that we should be preparing for in a more systematized way. I think that's a really interesting opportunity that it forces government to get outside its own really narrow strictures of views. And when you purposely bring in a more diverse body of partners to help you think about what the future might look like, you're going to do it better.
Let's talk about what's happening currently. There's a lot of different federal policies that are obviously going to have implications for state and local. And then there was effort the Department of Government Efficiency has done to reshape size, capacity, and certainly in some cases authority of different agencies. What do you make of some of the current actions? What do you think their long-term implications might be? And if you had any advice for the current administration, what might you tell it?
When you go and read the first initial executive order that was issued around the Department of Government Efficiency, there's a whole lot in there that certainly is attractive to me around helping senior leaders make better decisions with the toolkits they have and understanding better the levers that there is available to them when it comes to technology, procurement, talent, and otherwise. But then I feel like a lot of that got lost in the implementation of where to use a phrase, instead of ready, aim, fire, it became ready, fire, aim. And that a lot of changes were made without some of that strong assessment that could have been done around how do we actually, if we are truly operating towards government efficiency, or I think a better thing that for them to look at is optimization, then what are the things that we need to know early in order to do that? Whether that be if you're cutting a program, if you're cutting a data collection, if you're eliminating or eliminating a team, what are the downstream and upstream consequences? What are the relationships that all of those folks manage? So as an example, let's say that the CDC has a body of data that it collects from states and localities about public health that is then transferred to others in order to do work with. Even if for whatever reason you decided that wasn't necessary to exist in the federal infrastructure, a good way to go about that would be to say, like, all right, so the people who are providing us with the data, do they know where to provide the data to instead? Because there's a customer for that. And then likewise, the people who are the receiving end of the analysis that comes from that data, do they have an alternative place to be able to go? There's useful conversations you can have around how do we reset roles, responsibilities in the federal infrastructure, federal ecosystem, such that you're actually performing better for the American people. And I am very afraid that most of those conversations did not actually happen. That doesn't mean it's too late. And it is never too late to go in and say, how can we do this better? Where is it that we have, for a variety of reasons, discovered roles of the federal government that are critical and can go back to say, who are those critical stakeholders? Who are those customers that we need to care about? And have we transfer those customer relationships in a way that is going to serve the country better? Or are we, the federal government, the most critical node in that, and therefore we need to reset that in some way? So I think the advice I would give him at this moment is to say there is no harm and is actually enormous good in going back and look at some of the programmatic changes that have been made in the past several months to say, did that go as we assumed? How were those customer relationships impacted? Did we make the connections necessary in order to continue that mission area, which I think was their overall intent, or at least at the high level? Or did that get missed? And therefore, we as the federal government can help go and create and build those connections, or we can reinsert ourselves in that role in order to continue to provide that function.
Loren, my last question to you, you really described the opportunity that the current administration has. What might be your message to public administrators currently working in government and to those who are studying and helping to advance the field that might be outside of government as to how to make the most out of this opportunity that you've described and what's needed to help government be most effective, efficient, accountable, transparent going forward?
I think, harkening back to a theme I've had over and over again in this conversation, we all came into this field for a particular reason. And as I said, it's probably not in order to write the best possible budget or draft the best possible memo. Resetting back to what is the outcome that I'm actually trying to generate And using that as an opportunity to say, how the way I've been doing it, is that the best possible way to get there? And if it's not, can I start having conversations with those who are a part of my community to say, what are better ways to get there? And what is it that my stakeholders, I say the American people, but whoever your community is around that, like, what is it that they actually would want to happen in the best of all possible worlds? And use this as a moment for not only recognizing the value of what the federal government does today or did yesterday, but to rethink what was that purpose originally and how can we design better outcomes, better future around it, and how can we incorporate more of that ongoing listening, iterative feedback loops, iterative ability to improve into that future. None of us ever like to have crises be the thing that motivates us to do things differently, as much as it's like a trite saying, and it's always very stressful at that point in time. But we should use this crisis. If the degree that people think that you're in a crisis this moment in public administration because of all the change that's happening, use that as a moment to go back to basic precepts. What is it we're trying to do in terms of public service? When we say public administration, administration is not just minutely improving on the edges. It is meant to be towards a public good of some kind. What is that public good, and how can we actually do it better?
It's not just talking about reimagining or rebuilding government, but really outlining what's needed in the future and what are the steps that we need to take to get there. You've just heard from Loren DeJonge Schulman that being outcome focused and engaging the community is critically important to government meeting its full potential. Loren, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.